Okay, it is 1:30, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today for our Unique Terrariums for Indoor Spaces um, lecture. If you are having any technical difficulties, just type that into the chat box and Kari can help you resolve some of those issues once I get started. Okay, so today you're here for Unique Terrariums for Indoor Spaces. My name is Candice Miller. I'm an Extension Horticulture Educator with University of Illinois Extension, and I serve kind of the northwestern part of the state of Illinois, and it's a lovely 60, 65 degree day up here today, so I'm sure the rest of you all are enjoying this beautiful spring weather. So we are talking about indoor stuff today, but I kind of just want to be outside doing some of this as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I think we'll save our questions till the end. You're welcome to type them into the chat box as you think of them, but I think I'll address all of the questions once we get towards the end. Okay, so if you're not familiar with what a terrarium is, or if you've never seen a terrarium before, these are kind of some of the basic definitions of a general what a terrarium is. So by definition, it's usually a closed, clear, either glass or plastic container filled with small, kind of slow-growing plants, or it could also be an open container for growing plants. So most of us think of a terrarium as a closed container, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a closed container, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Another definition is just a novel way to grow plants with minimal care, which is kind of the great thing about terrariums, which you'll hopefully see by the end of this presentation. So history. So terrariums have been around for a long time. They date back to Greece about 2,500 years ago. So it's definitely not a new thing, but it's certainly a trendy thing that we keep seeing in garden centers and in gardening magazines. They continue to be a popular thing in the gardening world, which is great. The invention of the terrarium itself can be credited back to Dr. Ward, who was a 19th century physician in London, and he actually published a book that was all about his terrarium kind of research. And what he called them initially was Wardian cases. Of course, his name was Dr. Ward, so he named them after himself. But what he actually discovered is that he had a closed glass container that he had some objects in, not necessarily plants, and a small bit of growing media, and he intermittently had gotten a seed and a spore from a fern into this container, and it had started to grow. And over a period of years, he just kind of left it in there, and he realized how well the plant did in that closed environment. And this was in London in the 1800s when the air quality was very horrible because of the industrial things that were happening during those times. So he was a big plant collector, and many of the plants that he had, ferns in particular in London, were failing, of course, because of the horrible air conditions. But in this closed container, he realized how well this fern was growing because of the closed lid on this container. So he actually developed these cases that he called Wardian cases that were initially used to transport plants from country to country. So plant explorers would go to other countries, and typically before they would have to get those plants back to England or to wherever they were wanting to take them to through seeds or rhizomes or corms, something that could survive a long trip overseas. But with the development of his cases, he could now put these cases on the upper decks of ships, where you could put plants inside, living plants, and they would be able to survive a long journey overseas. So it's kind of a very cool invention and obviously a great boost for plant explorers during that time. So obviously today it's evolved to more of a smaller kind of indoor plant enjoyment type of thing. But initially it was a great thing for plant explorers to bring plants to other countries. So here are some of those Wardian case kind of sketches of what some of those might have looked like in those times. And you can find a lot more about the history of Wardian cases through some online searching. So I mentioned that by definition, a lot of times we think about a a terrarium being closed. And that, of course, is excellent because it keeps the humidity inside that container. So the great thing about that is that you don't have to water hardly at all. So Dr. Ward had this fern in that container, I believe he states, for about 4 years without any care at all, which is amazing. So the great thing about having a closed terrarium is that the water is going to evaporate, it's going to condense on the top of the container, and it's going to drop back down just like rain would naturally. So there's very little watering that's involved with a closed terrarium. So if you're one of those people that forgets to water things, a closed terrarium is a great option for you. The only downside, of course, though, is that you do have a very high humidity environment inside that container, of course, because there is a lid. So there is some danger of disease buildup, especially those fungal diseases that prefer a moist environment and a wet foliage. So you do have to monitor it a little bit for that. If you think it's getting too wet in there, too humid, you take the lid off for a little bit, let it air out, and then put that lid back on. So that's really the one downside of a closed terrarium, is that it does stay pretty moist in there. An open terrarium, though, like the one here on the right, of course, is great as well. It lets you get a little bit more creative in terms of design in some cases, but of course that's going to dry out more quickly. So it's going to take more maintenance in terms of making sure your watering is at the proper level. So either one are great options. It just kind of depends on how much care, time, and watering time you have for those. So what kind of container? So as you saw, by definition, we're looking at a clear container. So whether that clear container is glass or plastic or plexiglass, either way, as long as light can get in, almost anything could be a container for a terrarium, which is kind of cool. So if you get online on Pinterest and gardening magazines, there's always a lot of interesting container uses for terrariums, and I've tried a lot of these and they work very well. So here you can see some Christmas ornaments, and I've used these as gifts for the holidays. I'll put a couple plants in there, or even just some air plants, and have a little terrarium ornament, or fish bowls, fish tanks, glass mason jars, jugs, bottles. Like I said, anything that's clear and it'll allow some light through, you could turn that into a terrarium. So you'll even see online, this is one I haven't tried yet, but I want to, is people will create little terrarium necklaces out of a little glass bottle, and they'll put a little miniature plant in there and actually have it as a necklace, which I think is kind of cool. So as long as light can get through, you can turn about anything into a terrarium. So I tend to scour Goodwills and Salvation Armies and the thrift shops to find interesting containers, or craft stores, wherever you might look for containers, you can find interesting terrarium ones. So this is one from this spring. These are just those glass cinder blocks that you can use in your home, of course, but then craft stores will sell them with a little opening at the top so that you can fill that with a little bit of growing media, put a couple plants in there, and you have a pretty cool glass block terrarium. So what kind of soil needs to go in here? Now, obviously, just like with any house plant, we don't want to go out into the garden and dig up our garden soil and bring that indoors for planting, because for one thing, we might bring in some diseases and some insects along with it, but we're also going to be bringing in typically a very heavy clay soil in a lot of cases, which is not going to drain very well, and it's going to hold too much moisture. So we want to use a soilless mix for our terrarium, something that's going to be lightweight, it's going to be sterile, and it's going to be well drained so that our plants aren't going to sit in too much moisture for too long. So you can go to the garden center and purchase a pre-made soilless potting mix. Typically it's going to be a majority of peat moss, probably some vermiculite and some perlite mixed in there. So you can certainly purchase those pre-made or mix your own using those same ingredients. If you're going to be doing a large quantity, a lot of times it's more economical to mix your own. Now, fertilization. This is another great thing I love about terrariums, is that you really don't need to fertilize them at all. And I'm prone to forgetting to fertilize. So it's great. Because since we're in an enclosed small environment, we really don't want these plants to start growing like crazy. Otherwise, our terrarium is going to fill up too quickly. So when we're selecting our plants, we're selecting small, slow-growing plants. And if we went and fertilized those plants, especially with a lot of nitrogen, of course, that's going to induce some extra growth onto those plants that could easily outgrow our terrarium pretty quickly. So unless your terrarium plants are showing some signs of nutrient deficiencies, you really don't need any additional fertilization. And more than likely, the pre-made potting mix that you purchase may actually have a little bit of fertilizer in it already. So once they're established, and if they do start to show some nutrient deficiency symptoms, then you could apply some fertilizer. Otherwise, we really don't want too much additional growth, which is kind of nice. Okay, so what do you plant? This, I think, is the funnest part, picking what plants are going to go well in your terrarium. And there's certainly lots to choose from, and more garden centers are starting to sell plants specifically for terrariums or for fairy gardens. That's also a popular thing, and it's going to be the same plant options for both. You're just looking for slow-growing, small plants. So when you do select them, you want to make sure you are selecting, of course, plants that are going to fit the light situation that you have. So whether you have a sunny window on the southern or the western side, or a more shady window on the east or the north, you're going to pick your plants to go in the terrarium based on your location. And of course, you're going to select healthy, disease-free plants. So when you're at that garden center, inspect everything well. Make sure you're starting with a healthy plant, because in an enclosed environment, a disease issue or a pest issue can overrun pretty quickly. So we do want to make sure we're starting with nice, healthy plants. So I mentioned that most garden centers are going to have a section or an area that's just for terrarium plants or for fairy garden plants, because these are going to be plants that have been selected to have either a low growth or slow growing plant. Anything that's large, you can certainly use it, but you're going to have to do more maintenance because you're going to have to keep pruning that plant back in order to maintain it small enough to fit into your terrarium. So if you really are going for that low maintenance terrarium that doesn't take a lot of work, you're going to select those plants that are going to have that lower, more slower, dense growth so that you avoid some of those maintenance issues. So keep that in mind when you are selecting those plants. Okay. You can certainly think about themes too. I love creating terrariums based on themes, especially if you're doing this for a gift or something fun. You can choose your plants based on a theme. So maybe you're going for kind of a woodland type setting where you're going to maybe go with some mosses that would naturally grow in a wooded area. Maybe you would use some branches to create more of that woodland look inside there. Maybe some African violets or some kind of small flowering plant that would give that woodland feel. Desert is definitely an option. I love creating cacti and succulent terrariums, and I think I have some pictures later of those. Or tropical. So most of these plants that we're going to select are going to be tropical houseplants. So you could easily create a tropical look by selecting those plants as well as adding accessories. So in that fairy garden section, you're going to have things like lawn chairs and seashells, and you could add sand to it. So you can definitely have fun with it and add the accessories. I love adding accessories. Okay. Now, the plants you choose are also going to be kind of grouped by height. So you're going to have some plants that are on the small side, which is mostly what we're going to want. We're going to want small plants less than kind of 6 inches in height. You might have some medium plants available to you, more in the 6 to 12 inch height range. And then the tall plants are going to be more in the 12-inch range. So this is really going to depend on the size of your terrarium container. If you have a big glass aquarium, maybe that you're turning into a terrarium, you could certainly use those taller plants. But if you're having a small little mason jar terrarium size, you're going to be limited to those small, less than 6-inch height plants. So you're really going to base that height dependent on the size of the container that you're going to select. Okay, so something like angel vine, for example, is a very low growing kind of trailing plant. So this is something that would work well in a low, shallow terrarium. Over time, it's going to cover kind of the bottom of that terrarium. An angel vine prefers a bright, moist location. So if you're selecting that location, that terrarium to go into a brighter sunny window, angel vine would be a good choice. Baby tears would be another very low growing choice for a terrarium. So again, a low, shallow terrarium, or to mix with some of your taller things. I love adding these low things that are going to eventually kind of cover the soil area. Okay, it makes it look like it's a natural kind of forested area in there. And baby tears as well is going to prefer that bright, moist location. Parlor palm. So you're probably familiar with parlor palm as a large palm, as a houseplant. But when you get them at the immature, very small stage, you can certainly use those in a terrarium. So these here are probably only about 3 to 4 inches tall at this stage. So that would be great for using in a terrarium. But of course, you know, a parlor palm gets very large over time. So this is one where if you are wanting to maintain at that size, you're going to have to continually do some pruning to keep it at that size. So either stick this guy in a larger terrarium or just know that you are going to do a little bit of pruning. Okay, and a parlor palm is going to be able to tolerate a lower light situation. Too intense light on a parlor palm, and it actually tends to dry out very quickly and kind of burn on you. So keep that in a little bit of a lower light situation. Okay, so some low growing, and then here's a taller option. So I mentioned the light requirements of those couple of plants, and that's definitely one of the biggest things to consider when you're selecting what plants you're going to put together. You want to make sure that the plants you do select are going to have similar light conditions. So a lot of the ones that I'll show you have fairly close to kind of medium light requirements. So they're going to tolerate a bright window as well as a window that has a little bit less light to it. They're going to be a little bit more adaptable. But let's say you don't even have a window, a good window spot to put these in. You can certainly add supplemental lighting. So you could take fluorescent bulbs, place them within a couple inches of the top of your plants, and you could grow those terrariums under supplemental lighting. Okay, so if you don't have that ideal window, that's always an option. So in most cases where you want to place that terrarium within several feet of a bright window, okay, so a couple feet away from the window. If you had a southern facing window, for example, and let's say you had a closed terrarium and you put it directly in that southern facing window, it's going to get very intense. It's essentially a greenhouse. So that terrarium is going to get very warm in there, and the light is going to be intensified as it goes through that container. So it's best to not have it directly in that bright window. Otherwise, things are going to dry out pretty quickly and the light might be just too intense. So a couple of feet away is pretty ideal. I'm sitting in my office right now, and I do have a southern facing window in my office, which I love. And I'm looking at my terrariums. I have one that's about 4 feet from the window, and actually have some that are about probably 12 or so feet from the window up on a shelf. And they've been there for months, and the plants are still thriving very nicely. But I also have fluorescent bulbs in my office, which are on during the day. So even though these terrariums are about 12 to 15 feet from the window, I've selected low light things, and they're getting a little bit of light from that fluorescence, and they're doing just fine. So they are pretty adaptable when you choose the right plants for your location. So some more plant examples to look at. Begonias, of course, are a great option. Begonias are known to be shade plants, so these would be a great option for a terrarium in that lower to medium kind of light situation. And I love begonias because of the interesting foliages. You can have a lot of different textures, different color patterns to the foliage, and of course that beautiful kind of rosette of foliage. So when you go to the garden center, you'll probably have several different foliage types of begonias to select, and they really add a great kind of texture to your terrariums. Okay. The last thing to consider then is temperature. So we've looked at light, we've looked at moisture considerations, we've looked at the height of the plants. Now we want to make sure our temperatures are good for these terrariums. And luckily, most of these plants have been selected as houseplants, so they are going to be able to tolerate our natural, normal kind of house temperatures. Like I mentioned, the only time where things might get iffy is if you put it directly in the window and it gets too warm inside that terrarium. Or on the flip side, maybe your window is extremely drafty in the winter. That may also be a concern, where that terrarium may actually get too cold in that location. So in that case, you may want to move it farther from those drafty windows. So normal house temperatures, we're talking 65 to 75. Most of these plants will do just fine in that range. So some other plant options here to look at. Peperomia is another great low light option. There are several varieties of peperomias. Some of them have these more crinkled leaves, like this variety here. Some of them have a more smooth leaf to it. All of them are going to be a great choice for a terrarium. All very succulent plants, so they're not going to dry out very quickly. You're not going to have to water those much at all. Arrowhead Vine, again, like Parlor Palm, you might be familiar with Arrowhead Vine as a large house plant, where if you put it in a large hanging basket, it's going to fill that basket pretty well and kind of trail over the edge. But like Parlor Palm, if you get it at the smaller, more immature stage, it's a much smaller plant. So again, these are in a little 1-inch pot, so it's about a 3 to 4 inch sized plant. So again, as the leaves are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, so unless you have a large terrarium, you're going to have to come in and kind of prune out those larger leaves as they start to get too large. But I love the kind of pinkish, greenish coloration of those arrowhead vines. This is another kind of medium light lover. In low light, arrowhead vine's probably going to start to stretch on you and start to look a little straggly. So you may not want to put this guy in too low of a light situation. Polka Dot Plant is one of my favorites because of the awesome color to it. So you can have the bright pink and the green patterns like here, or you can have green and white patterns, bright pinks, light pinks, just a really good pop of color, because most of these things are going to be green, of course. But if you wanted to add some color, Polka Dot Plant is a great option. And this again is another kind of medium light situation. Here's the lighter pink, so the green with the lighter pink is another great option. There's lots of different ones to choose from when you go to the garden center, which is great. Nerve plant looks quite similar to Polka Dot Plant with similar coloration, so it can also have those bright pink to light pink veins to it, which again is a great way to add some color to your terrarium. But instead of having the more polka dot pattern, the colors are actually the veins, which is also a very cool coloration. Similar growing conditions in that low to mid light range with the nerve plant. Of course, lots of great fern options for terrariums, especially if you do have that lower light situation. Ferns are going to be a great option to go with, whether it's the little leatherleaf ferns or button ferns. So many varieties of ferns. All of them are going to do well in that moist, low light condition of a terrarium. So you typically have a large variety to choose from when you're at the garden center. Schefflera is another, again, larger houseplant that you see it in a large pot typically, but just like Parlor Palm and what was the other one we just talked about, and Arrowhead Vine, if you get it at that smaller stage when it's just starting to come up, you've just taken a cutting maybe, that would be a nice little small plant to put into a terrarium. But again, it's going to get large over time, so either put it into a larger container or keep pruning it so that it maintains that smaller size. But again, that's going to be a pretty low maintenance, low to medium light house plant to put in there. African violets are great. So obviously a lot of these are foliages, since most of these are foliage houseplants. But if you're going again for that woodland look where you want to bring in some flowers to it, African violets would be a great option. If you're familiar with watering African violets, of course, you typically water them from the bottom, so they do actually tolerate that moist soil conditions that a terrarium would have. So African violets would actually be a really great option for a terrarium. A little bit more light is needed for these guys, more in the medium range to bright range, especially if you are wanting good flowering. In too low of light, they're really going to stretch on you, and they're probably not going to flower very much. But even in the foliage stage, that nice rosette is also pretty attractive. So that's not the end of the world if it doesn't flower. Okay. Being that St. Patrick's Day is coming up soon, Oxalis is definitely a great option. So Oxalis or a shamrock plant is another common name for this one here. You can have the purple leafed varieties and the green leafed varieties, and then of course the excellent flowers on these guys. If you are wanting these to flower well, you'd certainly do need a brighter location for these. And what's kind of unique about Oxalis is that they grow by rhizomes. So if you take an Oxalis plant out of the pot, you can actually divide the plant into more sections by dividing up those rhizomes. So I do that quite a bit with terrariums, is I'll just break off a small chunk of the Oxalis, plant that into my terrarium, and then over time those rhizomes will expand and it'll fill out more and more. But I love adding that dark purple color in there to just add a little bit of pop of color. But again, brighter light if we want them to flower like they do. Purple Passion is another one that you might see pretty commonly in the garden center for terrariums or fairy gardens. This is very unique because it has that purple, almost pubescence to it. So really unique plant. But again, this one's going to need that brighter light situation. So if you're going for that purple color scheme, Purple Passion would be a great option. Don't count out grasses either. I love adding grasses to the landscape, but you can certainly add grasses into a terrarium. So these were little baby, about 1-inch pots of fiber optic grass, which you typically see in a larger pot to plant in the landscape or in containers. But if you can find them in these smaller sizes, this would be a really cool addition to a terrarium, a little tuft of grass in there. And there would be other grasses that you could divide up into smaller pieces and add into a terrarium as well pretty easily. Again, brighter light conditions for their grasses. Okay, so those are some of kind of my favorite options of terrarium plants and ones that you could try to start out with. Like I mentioned, you can certainly create themes for your terrariums, which I love to do, and I love succulents. That's my favorite group of plants, so I'm a big fan of creating succulent or cacti terrariums. And the procedure would be the same, but what I would want to do here is add a even more well-drained soil. So I would use probably a pre-made cacti and succulent potting mix that has some coarse sand to it so that it drains even better. But if you think about it, it's going to be a hot, dry condition in that terrarium unless you're overwatering. So these plants are going to tolerate that pretty well. So a couple of my favorites are things like kalanchoe or kalanchos. There's a lot of great kalanchoes that are succulents, like Panda Plant has a silver pubescence to it with a brown edge, almost like a panda, which is great. Sempervivums or hens and chicks you can grow out in your landscape, but you can also certainly bring those indoors and plant those into a terrarium. They, of course, are low growing, so they're going to kind of cover the bottom of your terrarium. very nicely. Jades, again, work well. Again, a jade plant is going to get very large over time, so either, again, larger terrarium or keep pruning that. Echeverias, or another common name for these is hens and chicks as well, but these are a larger rosette type of succulent, a lot of different color variations, and then a lot of sedums too, whether it's the ground cover sedums or the more upright sedums. Basically any succulent or cacti you could put into a terrarium as long as you have the proper soil and as long as you're monitoring your water and you're not over watering too much. So this terrarium here lives in my kitchen. It's a little neglected right now because it is a northern facing window, so it doesn't get as much light as it should, but I love where it's at, so I leave it. What I actually did with this one is filled this container with my cacti mix, and I actually just took cuttings of the succulents that I already had and stuck those right into my terrarium. I love succulents because they're so easy to propagate from cuttings. So I just took my cuttings, stuck them right into there, and they rooted right in place. And then this was during Christmas time, so I popped a couple of Christmas ornaments in there as well. So desert terrariums are great. I haven't expanded much into the carnivorous plants yet, or insectivorous plants, but you see a lot of examples of this, especially in gardening magazines. And if you think about it, it's a great idea because most of these carnivorous plants or insectivorous plants, they prefer like moist bog situations is where they grow naturally. So if you think about it in a terrarium, we can monitor the humidity inside there. We can monitor the watering, keep it at the proper moisture level. So for things like sundews or Venus flytraps, which is on the bottom here, and then pitcher plants on the right, this would be a great way to grow them because I have never had luck with carnivorous plants, and it's probably because I don't water them enough. But if I was able to put them in a contained environment, I think they would do much better. Air plants are another great option. I absolutely love air plants as well. And if you're familiar with air plants, you know they get that name because they don't need any soil. Okay, you just soak those air plants about once a week, put them in the sink, fill it with water, let them soak for 15 to 30 minutes so they get nice and full of moisture. Take them out, let them drain, and then just stick them into your terrarium or anywhere throughout your home, and then repeat for about the next week after that. So if you don't moisture and mist them or soak them well, they do dry out. But otherwise, if you keep that watering pretty good, they're a great addition to a terrarium, definitely. And there's lots of options for air plants nowadays too. Okay, so what type of tools do you need to create this? So now we'll talk about how do we kind of assemble this terrarium together. So one thing you might need are some long dowel rods or some long sticks, and they actually sell things that are made specifically for terrariums. And this would be for times when you have a very small opening to your terrarium. So if I go back to this pitcher plant terrarium here on the right, that has a pretty small opening at the top, and of course it's a very tall container. So in most cases you're not going to be able to fit your hand inside that opening. So that's why you take these long dowel rods or long sticks, able to put that into the opening to be able to manipulate the plant around, to dig holes and things like that. So this really depends on what type of container you're using. Now what I usually do is just select a container with a larger opening, so I don't have to do that as much. But if you have a container in mind that has that smaller opening, this is kind of your option for moving the plants around, digging your holes, and all of that. Okay, scissors are something you want to keep on hand to keep things pruned, especially for those larger plants that grow up quickly. A large spoon may be helpful, again, with a long handle, so that you can add your growing mix, your growing media, move things around. You might even need a funnel to get that growing media into the container if you have that small opening again. Once things are in there, More than likely, you probably will have some soil on the leaves just in the process of moving plants around. So like a turkey baster or a bulb sprayer or even just a small mist bottle is a good idea to rinse off that foliage, or not the foliage, rinse off the foliage with the soil on it. And also it can be helpful with watering. And they also sell even specialized sticks with a wire on the end, which is designed to help lower plants into those large containers with small openings. So again, if you have those taller containers with small openings, you might need some additional tools. Otherwise, there's not a lot of equipment involved, which is great. Accessories are one of my favorite parts then. So you're going to select your plants, of course, we talked about that. But then you can jazz it up with some accessories. So things like rocks and gravel and shells can be a great thing to cover the top of your soil with to give it a more kind of finished look. Any type of like plastic toys, ceramic figures. You can see this one here has dinosaurs in it, which would be great for kids. I like to use dried materials in there as well. So the one on the right here, I have some dried billy balls or crispidia in there, which is a great pop of yellow color. So as long as it's clean and sterile and you're not introducing any pests or diseases into your container, you can definitely add whatever accessories you want to fit your theme, to fit the look of the area that you're putting in. I like to add seasons to mine, so I'll put in Easter eggs or Christmas balls, things like that to go with the season. So accessories are a great thing to think about too. Okay, so how do we put this together? So in terms of design, like I mentioned when you're selecting your plants, you're going to think about the heights of the plants, the color, the texture, and I think it's great to have multiple plants within there so that you have that variation. In terms of plant placement, it's kind of up to you and what your container looks like and what the shape of it. So, and depending on which side you're going to view that terrarium from. So if you're creating more of a one-sided terrarium, you're going to probably start with those taller plants in the back, shorter plants in the front so that you can view everything. Or if it's an all-around type of container, you might start with that tallest plant in the middle and your shorter plants surrounding. So in terms of assembly of heights, it kind of depends on what your container looks like. You can think about recreating some natural environments too. So I love this one that I saw on Pinterest here. So you can use things like sand and rocks to create cliffs and ledges and stream beds or a tropical forest. So you can really create a look based on those kind of additional things you add in there, which is fun. So before you do anything, you want to clean everything really well. So I mentioned that I get a lot of my containers from the thrift stores. So obviously I want to wash those down well, get all the dust off, make sure they're free of any bacteria, anything like that. So wash it well with a soapy hot water or even a bleach mixture if you're really concerned. So all your tools, your containers, you want to wash down well before starting. And then the first thing we're going to add to our terrarium is a drainage material. So these containers, of course, they don't have a drainage. There's no hole in the bottom to allow excess water to drain, which is why we have to be very careful with our watering here. But we do have the leeway of adding a small layer of drainage material at the bottom. That way, if we do overwater, there's a small gap between where our soil starts and the bottom of the container where that extra water can sit. So if it's an open container, it could be various types of rock or gravel or stones. It could be decorative or it could just be plain old gravel. If it's a closed container, then we usually recommend that you add some charcoal to that drainage material layer. And what that charcoal will actually do is it helps absorb any chemicals or anything that would build up inside that closed container. So at the bottom of that container, you put about a half an inch. It could be more if you have a very large, tall container, but at minimum, you want at least kind of a half-inch layer at the bottom. And on the top of that, then you take some moss. So it could be sphagnum moss, it could be something more decorative. But the moss goes on top then to prevent the soil from falling down into your drainage material. So the moss just serves as a barrier between your growing media and then your drainage material at the bottom. Okay. So we've got our drainage material, then our layer of moss, and now we add our growing media. So our soilless media that we talked about earlier. You want about a quarter of the terrarium's volume used for the growing media and the drainage material. So let's say you have a 12-inch tall terrarium. You want that soil and the drainage material to take up about 3 inches of that container. So we're talking about a pretty shallow growing area, which again is why we're choosing small, low-growing plants. It's a good idea to go ahead and moisten your soil media before you put it into that container so that your plants are already getting started in a slightly moist mix. Okay. Then, once you have your soil in there, you're going to take your plants from their pots. If let's say the root ball is too high, maybe you have like a 3-inch tall root ball, you may have to actually remove a little bit of that root ball, maybe at the bottom where there's not a lot of roots. You can tear off a portion of that if the root ball is going to be too deep. And then those roots will branch out and they'll grow horizontally into your terrarium. So take them out of the pot, remove any excess media that we don't need. If there's any damaged leaves, we want to trim those off at this time. If it's pot bound, we certainly want to break up the roots at that time as well so that our roots are going to spread out nicely. So inspect that root ball, make sure it's prepped to go into our terrarium. And once we're putting things in the terrarium, it's a better idea in terms of kind of plant health to keep the foliage away from the sides of the container, because what will happen is that moisture will condensate on the container itself. And if the foliage is touching the side of the container, it's also going to just sit there in that moist condensation, and those leaves are probably going to become diseased and die anyways. So if you want to keep those leaves healthier, try to keep them away from the side of the container if you can. And then, as I mentioned, after planting, you're probably going to have some soilless mix on the leaves. So you want to spray that off with your mister to kind of keep off that foliage. And then if you do have a closed container, let that foliage dry off for a couple of hours and then go ahead and put your lid on. Otherwise, again, that foliage could stay too wet. So you want to let it dry off before you cover it. Okay. Now, watering. So how do we maintain that container? As I mentioned earlier, the great thing about a closed terrarium is that there's hardly much watering needed at all because it just condenses on the top and falls back down. So I would say check it every month for sure. So open that lid, stick your finger down into that media if you can get your hand in there, and just feel how moist it is. If it still feels moist, no need to water again. You can probably stretch it out to the 4 to 6 month time frame once you have things going well. Signs, of course, that you are needing to water would be that your plants are wilting or that you don't see any condensation on the side of the container. That's a sign that your terrarium is a little dry. You always want to water lightly because, as I said, there's no drainage. So always err on the side of underwatering as opposed to overwatering. Otherwise, you're going to fill up that drainage area and there's going to be nowhere for that water to go. So certainly do not overwater. Okay. In terms of maintenance, like I said, don't overwater. Keep an eye out for just kind of the overall look of the plant. If a leaf is starting to die, you can go in and prune that out. Turn the terrarium occasionally, especially if it's near a window, because of course the plants will start to grow towards the light. So an occasional turn will keep things growing vertically. And then again, just keep an eye on the growth of those plants. You may need to do some pruning and some pinching to maintain the smaller size of those plants. One thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about the closed containers is if let's say your container doesn't have a lid, a lot of them may not, you can certainly use things like press and seal or cling wrap and actually put that over the top of your terrarium to create your own lid. So even if your container doesn't have a lid, a little bit of press and seal on the top will create the same idea. It won't look as pretty, of course, as a lid, but it does the job. Okay. A couple of resources. There are lots of great fact sheets from various extension sources on terrariums. So if you need some plant lists, things like that, just do a search for terrariums and then add extension to your search and you'll come up with quite a few great resources there. There's a couple of great terrarium books here that I mentioned. So if you're wanting inspiration in terms of design and what plants to go with, check out those couple of resources. Many of the photos are my own, but the ones that I noted came from Pinterest. So I put all of those onto a Pinterest board here. So if you're interested in viewing those photos again, they are available on that Pinterest board. Here is my contact information. So if you do have any questions or if you make a terrarium after today, send me a picture. I'd love to see kind of what you come up with. Always happy to help. And this will of course be recorded, and it is being recorded right now. And once it is done, next week we will post the recording onto our Four Seasons YouTube channel. So check for that. And there's also a large number of videos that are already posted. So if you're looking to get some education, check out that channel. And with that, I will open it up to questions. So I saw one question here from Jackson. For a desert terrarium, would you want it to be left open? And I think you could do it either way. The ones that I've done have been open just so that they do dry out quicker. You could do it in a closed container, but you would really have to be careful about not overwatering. And you would really have to watch that humidity. So I would probably prefer it in an opened container, but you could probably make it work in a closed if you monitored that watering really well. Let's see. Any tips on creating a terrarium as an indoor frog habitat? I would say go for it. I don't know a lot about frogs in terms of what they need for food or things like that, but I think again, as long as everything's sterile and you have healthy plants and you're not adding any kind of toxins to the environment with what you're putting in, I would say that would be an excellent habitat for a frog, especially in a larger kind of aquarium type setting. Do you wash your rocks and pebbles before adding? You know, if I put it on the soil surface, I usually do, because it's usually kind of dusty and messy a lot of times. So I will occasionally, put it into a colander and rinse those off. If I'm just using it for my drainage material, I don't worry about it because it's going in the bottom of the terrarium and my plants aren't really going to come in contact with it. Is misting enough, or does the growing material need to be watered? That really depends on how dry your terrarium is. If you have a closed terrarium and it's maintaining moisture pretty good, a misting would do you pretty well. But if you had an open terrarium that's going to dry out faster, misting would probably not be enough. So I would recommend a light watering to the soil itself to get that saturated. And that's typically what I do with my terrariums, is I will just do a light watering to the soil. Because again, if I can keep the foliage dry, I would much prefer that so that I could avoid any disease issues that might develop because of that. Okay. Any other questions? You're welcome to unmute and ask questions as well. How do you water the African violets? Same thing. I would water the soil. Okay, so just like you would water an African violet in a pot, you want to avoid getting the foliage wet, especially if it's cold water, because then you tend to have damage. So again, just lightly water the soil area around that African violet, and that will do it well. Just keep that foliage dry if you can. I had an open terrarium with a few succulent plants, and then a mold formed in the soil, and everything looked bad. I used a new media and never overwatered. In fact, I underwatered probably. What can I do to discourage mold growth? And that's, even though you probably did overwater, more than likely there was probably just too much humidity in that container. So what you might try would be even a more open container and see how that does, and just be really careful about monitoring that water. So that one I have in my kitchen, it probably has like a 6-inch opening at the top, and I do get the occasional mold growth in that container right after I water, because it still has some pretty good humidity in there. So I just monitor it, make sure I let it dry out really well before I water again, and things seem to be okay. So I would try to get a more open container and really monitor that water. Where can I find info about getting cuttings from succulents that I already have? Good question. There are a lot of great online resources for that. If you just type into Google succulent cuttings and you add extension in with it, I know there's several good tutorials. But essentially, you're either going to take a couple inch stem cutting, or you're going to take a leaf cutting. And what's different about succulent cuttings is that you want to let them callus for a couple days before you put it into the soil. So you're going to take your cutting, let's say today, remove a couple of the lower leaves from your stem, and then let it sit there on the counter for like 4 to 7 days. And then once it's healed over, you can go ahead and put it into your media. But there's a lot of great online extension info if you just do a Google search. Can you use regular tap water to water? Absolutely. That's what I use. Now, if I don't do a lot with like really sensitive ferns, but if I was growing some of these houseplants that do tend to brown from tap water, then I might use like distilled water. But for what I grow, tap water works just fine. So keep an eye on it. If you are getting some brown edges like from fluoride, then you might want to use distilled water. Lifespan of a typical tropical type closed terrarium. Years, to be honest. You could have that same plant in a terrarium for, I dare to say, like 50 years. But if you, honestly, you could. If you monitored it well, and there are certainly people who have had terrariums for that long. So they are very long-lived. Okay, I'll give it a little while. Make sure I didn't miss any. Okay, well, I'll stay on for another minute or so if you do have any last minute questions. Otherwise, thanks everybody for coming. Hopefully you'll all go forth and create some terrariums now.